Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be about how anyone can be an artist and create beautiful art. My art journey began when I was very little. I remember the first time that creating art became more than a simple, fun, and limitless activity that was void of judgment. I drew a candle that was sitting on my dining room table one evening. At this moment, I decided to push myself creatively and try to draw this object as realistically as possible, just for my own fun. I succeeded, and I did a great job. The drawing looked more realistic than any of my previous creations. I enjoyed the challenge, the process, and the product. However, my perception shifted when I realized I received more praise and acknowledgement of my talent for this random drawing than I had received for anything else I had ever made. And it seemed my intention for the piece, nor the subject matter, influenced the perception that this piece of art was better than all the rest. This small shift made me aware of the fact that art could be labeled and valued as good, or less good, or even bad. I previously saw creating art as something that was simply a pleasurable activity with no association whatsoever, that what I created would be judged as good or bad. I've been wrestling with this idea ever since. Recently, though, I've been striving to push back against that idea that art can be determined to be good or bad. Art, and the creation of it, is so much more than the binary of good and bad. And to reduce it to such binary takes away all that it really is. Art is a social and cultural conduit. It sparks emotion and conversation. It passes down tradition and stories. Art cannot simply be good or bad. And to think of it as such is ultimately a disservice to yourself or your community. So, here are my tips for how anyone can be a magnificent artist. Tip number 1. Notice and reframe your expectations around art. Observe what expectations you hold for making art, being an artist, and creating in general. Pay attention to what you label as good or bad, and question why you think that. Maybe you're telling yourself a story like, I don't have the time or money to do art. Notice that. Notice what you believe your limitations to be. It may be enlightening to think back to school art classes. How were you spoken to about your art? Were you praised, shamed, rewarded, or stifled? And these can all give you insight into what expectations you hold for yourself in terms of making art. Once you've identified where you are now and what your expectations are, you can move towards shifting and reframing those expectations of what art is and what it can be. You can do this by visiting museums. and looking at a wide breadth of art in different styles, types, sizes, mediums, backgrounds, eras, and feelings. It's especially helpful to look at art, I think, that you find bad or that goes against the perception of what you think good art is. This will remind you that art exists beyond that good and bad binary. It exists beyond your or anyone's preferences or tastes. The idea here is that you want to expand your idea of what can even constitute art. So tip number 1, notice and reframe your expectations around art. Tip number 2, reserve judgment of your art until you have repeated the creation process at least 100 times. No one is good when they first start something. Any Major League sports player didn't just wake up one day good at their sport. It took a lot of repetitive practice. I think with art, we get stuck in this judgment of our first creations, and we decide we are bad at art. But have you tried getting better? And if not, actually let yourself be bad and try putting in the practice to get better. Let yourself have a trial period where you just know you'll make ugly art that you don't like, and focus more on the process of creating and finding what you enjoy about it, rather than focusing on each individual creation and the minute details of each one. Don't judge your creations as good or bad. Instead, just acknowledge that you have brought them to life and that there is beauty in that alone. The process of making it 100 times will get you out of the mindset of perfectionism and into just the process of creating. So tip number 2 is to reserve judgment of your art until you have repeated the creation process at least 100 times. I mean literally. Tip number 3. Everything in art is a learnable skill. The only thing you cannot learn is the drive to create. If you have any drive in yourself to create anything, then that is simply all you need to do art and be an artist. Everything else is simply a learnable skill. Any admirable, reputable, famous, or established artist that you can imagine or look up to, at one point created shitty art, and to their standards probably still creates shitty art. Their artistic ability is a skill they have honed over time, not something they were inherently gifted with. They had to learn every single skill they know as an artist, from how to sketch, to color theory, to creating texture with paint, to whatever their set of skills are. They are not skills that a person has at birth. Tip number 3 is that everything in art is a learnable skill. The only thing you cannot learn is the drive to create. Tip number 4. Notice what your intentions are when making art. Are you more interested in the final product or the process? Are you making art for yourself or for others? You don't need to change or place judgment upon whatever you notice to be there. Instead, let that guide and inform your creation process. Let yourself find more depth and enjoyment in whatever aspect of the process you are most excited about. If that is in sharing it with others and getting the feedback and stimulation of sharing with your community, then linger and explore that part of it. Or, if you really just enjoy the intimate process of making the art, then maybe don't push yourself to feel like you need to share it with the world. I know that sometimes I get so focused on the final product being perfect that I forget that really my intention and desire is to enjoy the process of making art, and that I don't really care how perfect it is. So tip number 4 is just notice what your intentions are for making art and lean into them. Tip number 5, be present with the sensory experience of creating. What does it feel like? Look like? Smell like? Sound like? What are enjoyable colors to use? Or shapes to make? Or movements to find? When you have released the judgment of your creations, and you have accepted that you will need to create an innumerable amount of repetitions in order to develop your artistic skills, then you can sit back and enjoy the very sensory and somatic experience of making art. Play with it. Have fun with it. Feel free and limitless. Imagine you are a child again, trying something for the first time, with wide-eyed wonder and excitement, and let yourself roam free. But pay attention and be present to the way that it feels. Notice the little details about it. So tip 5 is just be present with the sensory experience of creating the art. Tip number 6, don't get disheartened. Making art takes practice and development. Every artist looks back and is critical of their past work because they have grown, experimented, and practiced. So let yourself make shitty art. Make the worst art ever. Make art that's so bad that you can't imagine showing it to anyone. And then make more shitty art. And keep making shitty art until you find the enjoyment in the process and the enjoyment in breaking down the ideals, standards, and expectations that you once had around art. Remember that perfection is a mirage that will always exist at an arm's distance away. Imagine a track runner, for example, who has just set a new personal record. Immediately, they will have gained the skills and experience in that moment during that race to then be able to exceed that current personal best again the next time. With every change and improvement you make to a piece of art you're working on, you are learning about your process and honing your skills. You are becoming a better artist with every stroke. So tip 6, the last tip, is just don't get disheartened. Making art takes practice, development, and time. let me summarize the tips that I gave you today for how anybody can be an artist. Tip number 1, notice what your expectations are around art and release and reframe them. Tip 2, reserve your judgment of your art until you have repeated the creation process at least 100 times. Tip 3, everything in art is a learnable skill. The only thing you cannot learn is the desire to create. Tip 4, notice what your intentions are when making art. Tip 5, be present with the sensory experience of creating. And tip 6, don't get disheartened. Making art takes practice and development. Those are my tips for how anyone can be an artist. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. I hope that these were helpful. If anything resonated with you, leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for joining me today and showing up exactly as you are. I make videos every Sunday about art, advice, and adventure. Please subscribe if you think you're interested. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and drop a comment because it really helps. And I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you. Bye.